Today I decided to use this scripture from Ezekiel, which is a little unusual on Easter maybe. It's kind of its own resurrection story. Just to set the scene, it was about 600 years before Jesus. And God's people, the Judeans, were under the control of Babylon, and they rebelled against the Babylonians, and they were defeated. So many of the leaders were taken away and forced to live in exile in Babylon to kind of keep them under control. Today, that area is Iraq. Well, 10 years later, there was another rebellion, and this time, the Babylonians, to punish the Jews, destroyed Jerusalem. All of it, the temple, any important structure they destroyed. And it was the end of the monarchy of the line of David, King David, who killed Goliath and became the greatest king the Jews ever had, and Jesus was a descendant of him. Well, he was the start of that line. This was the last king in that line as their government was totally disrupted. The rest of the important leaders, anybody who was left, were hauled off and taken to join in the exile. A lot of the people were forced to go as well. Imagine another nation taking over, crushing all of our historical and cultural sites, hauling away all the leaders, destroying the churches and places of worship. All the leaders, religious leaders, community organizers, political leaders, anybody who was good at organizing people, they were all taken away. Imagine if they would all be taken and sent to Iraq and the rest of us would be left here. It was a very bad time for them. It was hard to have any hope. Now, things were bad before the first exile. So they fought back, exile happened, and then it got worse. So they planned and they plotted for 10 years, and they got their bravery up, and they got ready, and they rebelled again, and they were completely crushed. And then things got even worse as the oppressors just rubbed out every bit of spirit they had, took away every symbol of hope they had. And then God sent this message of hope, this dream of Ezekiel's. And this bit of hope was what it took to help them to eventually rise again. But it took generations. But eventually there was a new temple, a new Jerusalem. Of course, history has repeated itself since then. The temple was again destroyed later, and God's people have suffered through other dark times. But the point of this prophecy is that there is always hope, even in a pile of dry bones. In Ezekiel's dream, it wasn't just about death. These bones were dry. This was not one of these stories where somebody was kind of sick and God got him better. In this dream, it was complete desolation. And you think about what the people were feeling at the time. It was complete desolation. Their leaders were gone. They were living an unpleasant life. They were stuck under the same oppression. They were thoroughly defeated, had no inspiration, no leadership, no place of worship, and nobody had any plan of how to make anything even a little bit better. And Ezekiel told the people that even as bad as things were, God was going to breathe life into this community. It wasn't going to happen tomorrow, but it was going to happen. Their descendants would have the land of milk and honey again. The temple would be rebuilt. Their nation would be great. They would serve God, and it would be like it was under King David. One of the most popular TV series over the past few years is The Walking Dead. Any Walking Dead fans here? All right, couple hands. I could not stand this show. I was terrified of it. I thought it was way too gory, and now I've downloaded every single episode. I find it riveting, and what pulled me in is it points out just how much we rely on our security and our safety in our nation, and on all the little things that keep us comfortable, all those commonplace things that we take for granted. The show is about a zombie apocalypse. There's this terrible disease, and it causes people to come to life after they die, and they wander the earth trying to eat the living. There are very few survivors, and many of the people that survive are criminals. They try to band together to survive, but the thing that gets me about the show is the biggest struggle is not surviving the monsters. The biggest struggle is having any reason to bother surviving. It's the hope. How do you have any hope when everybody you know gets killed by a zombie? And then they become a zombie themselves. As the show goes on, you're confronted with, how do you protect a baby? How do you raise a child? What future can the world possibly have? How will we survive once we can't find any more canned food? They manage to get a safe area and grow some crops, but the criminals just show up and destroy it. We've certainly seen some situations in real life that are devoid of hope. Think back to the time of African slavery and what that must have been like, the Holocaust and World War II. These were times when God's hope somehow got people through a terrible situation. Some of you met my mom at the holiday festival this year. She spent a lot of time in Cambodia, so I've learned a lot about Cambodia. And I think that's where we're going to see God's resurrecting hope this morning on Easter. I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story of Cambodia. And I'm going to start during the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese military, North Vietnamese, started to hide their troops across the border in Cambodia, thinking they would be safe there. So the U.S. began bombing their camps in Cambodia. And these bombing runs may have aided in the war effort, but a lot of Cambodian civilians were being killed and injured as well. These were people that were not involved in the war in any way. They were just peasants and farmers. And so they started to flee their farms and their areas where they could support themselves to the cities, where they'd be safe. Well, the shift in population destabilized the government that was already a shambles. And then the U.S. pulled out of Southeast Asia in 1975, and that was one less policeman in the neighborhood. Pol Pot moved in. He brought his guerrilla troops in and took over the country, made himself the dictator, and he's one of the most notorious in human history. He created a closed country. He eliminated TV, newspapers, and radio, and tightly controlled the mail and the telephone. He eliminated all money, all business, all religion, all schools, and all healthcare. He had this idea of a perfect world that was loosely based on Chinese communism, where everybody would be equal. Everybody would be a peasant farmer. So everybody was removed from the cities and forced to work on farms that were more like concentration camps. They worked 18 hours a day and got one serving of rice every other day. A communist leader was put in charge of each small group of leaders, so parents were no longer in charge of their children. Children were only to listen to the party leader. And if you disagreed, or you didn't work hard enough, or you were suspected of something, or somebody wanted to gain some benefit by falsely accusing you of something, well, then you were killed, or maybe tortured and killed. To create the equal society, everyone who wasn't a peasant farmer was eliminated, starved or killed. All religious leaders, anybody who had been a doctor or a nurse or a teacher or a lawyer or a police officer were killed. Wearing glasses became a sign that you were educated, so anybody who wore glasses or was remembered to have worn glasses before was killed. The estimates range between 1 and 3 million people were killed in a country about the size of Wisconsin. At least a quarter of the population. Everybody either died, lived in terror, or was doing the killing. After just a few years, Vietnam invaded and installed a puppet government. And for the next 20 years, the people of Cambodia lived under a combination of this corrupt and ineffective government and Pol Pot, who retreated to the jungle and continued to have a great deal of power from there. They were still oppressed, they were still starving, and Pol Pot, to wield his power, used a lot of terror. They dug up landmines left over from the war and brought them into town and buried them where the children would play, or in people's gardens, or in the middle of the street. Soon, a huge percentage of the people were walking around missing a limb. Snipers would hide and randomly shoot people in the streets. And then, there was one woman, and I'm going to tell you her story. Fei Nguyen, she survived. She and her family were sent to the killing fields. She had 3 children, ages 12, 6, and a little infant. Her husband was taken away and separated from her. She was forced to watch while her 12-year-old daughter was raped and murdered, and then sent to the labor camp. And somebody there wanted to gain something, and so they falsely accused her of something, and she was taken to the ravine. And at this particular camp, the ravine was known as the place where people went to die. They had bamboo stakes in the ground at the top of this ravine, and she was tied to that stake so that she wouldn't fall in. And then she was handed her baby and her 6-year-old, and she was the only thing that was keeping them from falling in. The idea was eventually she would pass out or starve to death or something and would let go, and then they would cut her and let her fall in too. Well, after enduring this and watching other people fall in, one time when a guard came by, she convinced him that she was a former mistress of an official in Pol Pot's army. She wasn't, But for whatever reason, she knew this guy's name, and it worked. The soldier released her and her children and said that if anyone saw her, they would be killed on sight. So she ran into the jungle with her children and hid. They lived on bugs and plants, moving to stay away from any human activity. But they became more and more malnourished, and eventually she was unable to breastfeed her baby anymore, and he died as well. Finally, after 2 years in the jungle, Pol Pot was removed. So she and her one remaining child ventured back into the city. She found her husband. He had been beaten so badly that he was severely brain damaged and could barely function. They were taken to a refugee camp. While there, she became concerned with the others in the camp. The people would just lay on cots all day. They would hardly even get up to eat. They didn't do anything. They didn't even take care of their own children. They were so depressed, so broken, so devoid of any hope that they were dead to the world. They couldn't see the future, and they couldn't bear, even for a moment, to think about their past. So many people had been killed. And there were no schools to educate their children. There were no religious institutions, no organizations. Their government was still useless. There wasn't enough food, even in the camp. And there were no doctors. Literally, no doctors in the entire country. Occasionally, a foreign doctor would come and visit for a short time. But for the most part, people were suffering from just minor things and dying from them. She decided she needed to find a way to help, to do something. So she started to reach out to the other women in the camp and talk to them. And over time, she developed a method for helping other women. The first thing she would do is get them to tell her their terrible stories. And somehow she found the strength to listen to story after story. Gradually, as they told the story and then talked with her, they were able to get something else in their head, to think about something. And then she taught them to work. It might just be some minor thing like cleaning their shelter or some little job around the camp. But they had something they could do that was productive, that they could complete and feel good about. Once they had a job that they could do and they were doing it regularly, she did phase 3. She taught them how to do manicures and pedicures. It seems kind of trivial for people that had lived through all this to worry about having pretty nails. But she did it quite intentionally. She saw that the Cambodian people did not trust anybody. They could not look one another in the eye. They didn't have a meaningful conversation of any kind with one another, because anybody else around you might have been one of the people involved in killing your family. In doing manicures and pedicures, they had to be up close and personal. They had to touch another person. Gradually, they could look them in the eye as they talked with each other and shared their lives, told stories about things that were happening day to day. And gradually, they learned how to trust each other and had really pretty nails. She was able to help hundreds of women. And many of those women then took her method and used that to go do the same with others. Each of them was able to share this system of emerging from the valley of dry bones. Well, eventually, after she got out of the camp and was more established, she founded an orphanage to care for children who had lost both of their parents, either to disease or the atrocities or malnourishment. And many of the women that she had touched heard about this orphanage and came to work there with her. And they've been in operation now for decades and care for almost 300 children at any given time. And the people of Cambodia, who had been so hopeless, have been resurrected. My mom started going there almost 20 years ago. She's been there something like 15 times. I think she's lost count. She just got back a few weeks ago, and she'll be going back this summer. And she has seen the nation transform during that time. Several years ago, they had their first real democratic elections. They weren't rigged, and most importantly, when the election was over, there was no violence. Everybody accepted the results and went ahead. You know, the first year she went, her doctor sent her with this whole suitcase full of medication. Because there weren't any doctors, there was no health care. If she got an ear infection or whatever, she would need the right medication. So she had this complicated list, what she should take, depending on what went wrong. Now, she takes along a little Tylenol, because there are modern hospitals. There are places of worship again. The United Methodist Church that she works with there is exploding. You know how it's exciting that we have Eric, who's in seminary to be a pastor, and he's a child of this congregation? That's a great thing to have one of your kids from your church become a pastor. They have dozens of young people in this congregation in Cambodia that are studying to be pastors. The landmines have been removed from huge areas so people can farm, they can walk about and play safely, and tourism has grown 1,000-fold. People come to see the temples of Angkor Wat, experience the culture, see the museums about the killing fields, and enjoy the beaches. My mom has taught English so that the people would be more equipped to work in the tourist industry. That was one of her first goals, because they were starting to build hotels and restaurants for the tourists that were coming. Well, now she doesn't teach English because there are better options. People can learn it faster, other ways, with trained professionals. They have now dug 88 wells, she and her friend, in this community. She's helped equip them with computers and started a computer training program. She's led Vacation Bible School. She encourages and teaches their pastors. And she has taught many people how to sew, both so that they can make things for themselves and also so they have things to sell to tourists. She's been working on setting up a sort of sewing academy, and it's going to have a store and be a place where people can come and watch the craftspeople making these things. She had this one child who was there from the very beginning when she started going, and the girl grew up, and she wanted this girl to go to college because the girl had a dream of becoming educated, and it was a very rare thing around there. So she saved money and she got donations, and she sent this young person away to college. But in order to go to college, you had to move to Japan or Thailand. It was expensive, and you had to go live somewhere else where they spoke a different language, the culture was different, and where nobody had the same background. The other students were all wealthy middle-class people with cell phones. They didn't grow up starving with parents who had survived the atrocities. Well, now there's a university right in the city where my mom works when she's there. So she spent time raising money to send students there. For $500 a semester, sorry, I got behind one. There's the college. $500 a semester, a student can get a bachelor's degree, including tuition, books, uniform, housing, the whole thing. So she now has 9 students. A couple of them went to hotel and restaurant management school. Some are in seminary to be pastors. One is in medical school, and another one is headed there. It's interesting, she was in her early 50s the first time she went. But she was considered very old. Out of the many thousands of people she encountered, and back then she was one of the very few Westerners in that community. So everybody noticed her. In all those thousands of people she met, she only met one person who was her age or older. Between the atrocities and the malnutrition and the complete lack of health care, 50 was elderly. People came up to her on the street and said, "Oh, madam, you are so old." They meant it as a compliment, you know, she had accomplished something great. Now there are lots of people who are going gray, and that's a good thing. It's a sign of hope, because those people who are going gray are the last of the people who will remember anything of the darkest days. The younger generation now is far more concerned about their career and how they can continue to improve their country, how they can grow their church. At first there were just some signs of hope, and now there are very few signs left of the darkest times. Cambodia is a beautiful, thriving place, but it was a valley of dry bones. And as we celebrate Easter and think about new life where there was before only death, we can take hope. Jesus, the last few days were not good. He was tortured and cruelly killed. His own people sold him out. They bent the rules and told lies and became an angry mob to get him executed. And his family and friends and followers were left feeling destitute. People had waited thousands of years for the Messiah. He finally came. He was here for just a short time, and instead of everybody joining in the excitement, the vast majority had rejected him, and now he was gone. And then, a sign of hope. And with Jesus in their hearts, leading their way, they became Christianity. And now, as their descendants, we bring that hope We bring it all over the world. When there's a disaster, when someone needs to be fed, when we fight for justice, when we welcome someone who's been rejected, when we comfort someone who is grieving. I recently had somebody come to me and ask, how can there be any hope for me? They were going through a very difficult time in their life. And I told them that our God is so forgiving that every outcast, every wounded person, every criminal who has ever asked has been offered the forgiveness and love of God. I said that our God is so loving that we are never left alone, even when the world leaves us alone. Our God is so powerful that even in the worst valley of dry bones, where there is no sign of life, there is still hope and resurrection. Praise God for the resurrection of our ancestors in faith, of Jesus, and the resurrection of the most hopeless places imaginable. May God bring new life to you each day as you carry this hope in your heart. Amen.